A very good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, maybe the wind lost your voices. A very good morning, everyone. Fantastic. It's a real delight to welcome you all to this Think Budget Breakfast, which is brought to you by RMB. My name is Gugulethu Mfuphi, and I have the pleasure of being your moderator for the next 2 hours, where we look to certainly deliberate on many of the key themes that have been delivered in the budget speech. I think first things first, for many of us who are here in the room, naturally you represent significant key clients, partners, and stakeholder groups, not only to the South African economy, but to RMB as an institution. So we appreciate you taking out the time to join us today to really ensure that we fully unpack the details and, of course, get to the facts of the budget speech. So it's quite clear we have something to work with. Finally. It's been a long 3 weeks, but here we are. And I think after the last, almost 24 hours, we've been able to deliberate on some of the key themes that have come out. Of course, an understanding on our positioning regarding VAT and the proposed increase of 50 basis points, understanding, again, certain levers that had to be pulled and adjustments regarding the February budget that was proposed and changes that were implemented and delivered yesterday, but most importantly, where we stand with regard to cultivating positive economic growth for South Africa's economy. There's a number of levers and conversations and themes that come top of mind, and this morning, not only will we get to hear some perspective and reaction to the budget speech, but most importantly, hearing from individuals who, like yourself, take this information and, of course, need to unpack it and distill it in such a manner for it to make sense, not only for the South African public at large and the impact it will have on consumers, but also the overall operating environment when it comes to the investment landscape in South Africa. So we're looking forward to your interaction. As you can tell, we're in a wonderful, intimate setting, and this does mean that we have a phenomenal opportunity for you too to be participants in these conversations. Through our keynote address and, of course, a panel discussion that we'll hear from various speakers who'll give us some knowledge and insight that we will be able to walk away with today, and most importantly, also get their understanding of further themes that we need to probe going forward as we move on to make key decisions in our institutions that we represent. So I trust that those of you here in the room are as excited as I am, because there's a lot to distill, and we're definitely going to deep dive into the thick of it. And most importantly, those of you who are joining us as well online via LinkedIn. We appreciate your time and participation, and you too will also be included in this conversation. All you need to do is make sure that you send your messages through the chat service. We will be able to moderate them, just to keep to the themes that we're discussing and that will be brought up, and ensure that we're able to address those questions adequately. But without further ado, I guess briefly on the house rules, we're all very familiar with the fact that whilst we keep the economy going, there's calls to take, messages to respond to, texts to reply. Please do ensure that as you do so, keep your phones on silent. It's a polite request just to ensure that as our respective speakers make their way up and engage in conversation, that we just offer them the platform to ensure that there's minimal disruptions in the room. Restrooms are located outside, just outside the registration table to your left-hand side. And of course, refreshments and breakfast will continue to be available for you at the end of today's briefing, which should end roughly at about 10:30. Since we're all comfortable, we've crunched the numbers. Do we have some questions? I'll tell you what, we'll answer them nonetheless for you when we do get to our panel discussion. But for the moment, ladies and gentlemen, really critical that we obviously take an opportunity to acknowledge everyone who is here in the room and an understanding of the importance of your partnership and camaraderie as key stakeholders to RMB as a group. To warmly welcome us and give us the introduction and tone, and maybe even his perspective on the budget speech this morning, please warmly welcome to the front of the stage the Chief Economist at RMB Group, Isaah Mhlanga.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to see many faces that we have seen in most of our client events. For the last 2 years, we have been hosting this post-budget breakfast. We have had the honor of having the finance minister, but we thought this year, perhaps this time is different, given that we are in a different setting, the government of national unity, and there's a lot of parliamentary processes that we don't usually engage in because we have assumed once the budget is tabled, it's passed. But as we are going to hear from our speakers today, potentially that's quite different. And you had the pleasure of joining other post-budget breakfasts, but thank you so much for choosing us. Our partnership with you, with RMB Global Markets and Sales and Research, we really value it. conversations on the budget that are really of national importance, beyond businesses or the businesses that we run, beyond our own personal interest. It's really of national importance, and as such, we are grateful that you take your time through the morning winds to come and engage with us to get different viewpoints on how does this impact your own personal lives, your businesses, but what does it mean for the country at large. So with those short words, thank you so much, and I hope you are going to enjoy the engagements, and do ask hard questions. We have a panel that is quite esteemed, that has been in the thick of things. Dr. Roy Havemann has been a treasury, so he's an inside from his time back at the National Treasury. He's no longer there. I'm sure they're going to do proper introductions. Mr. Zibi sits right at the top. He holds parliamentarians to account as far as public accounts are concerned. He's here in his position as a parliamentarian, not necessarily from his home political party, but you never know what politicians do. But take the opportunity to ask. Prof. Jantjies also sits in the Parliamentary Budget Office. Again, that emphasis of trying to understand the processes, I think, is going to come through. So thank you so much. Enjoy. And let's see where we go from here, given the changes in the budget process. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Isaah. And as you've correctly stated, it is a very different time. Many of us have perhaps reflected on previous budget speeches, and perhaps now you know that, hold on, things perhaps this time around are not as predictable as they were in the past. Many themes that we do need to be mindful of, and also a deeper understanding of the complexities that might come about as the process does move forward, to ensure that there is clarity and alignment on the outcomes from the proposed budget speech. Well, one of our keynote speakers today, ladies and gentlemen, who is joining us, is a familiar face to many of us. Not only was his face on a ballot paper, but as has been mentioned, he's actually here as the chairperson of SCOPA. That's the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, to give us some insight into, of course, not only reflections on the budget speech, but most importantly, giving us some details regarding the shifts, the dynamics, and most importantly, key areas that we do need to be mindful of that do play a critical role when it comes to the fiscus. He's also had an opportunity to sit on the other side of the spectrum with a background in terms of media, but of course has certainly been able to garner a wealth of experience and expertise with regard to the critical questions and aspects that we need to be mindful of with regard to public accounts. Please warmly, and when I say warmly, it can have a little bit more excitement in it. Maybe a whistle and some ululating if I challenge you. But most importantly, what we also look forward to is the conversation that we'll have with him in the panel discussion. But to set the tone, ladies and gentlemen, for this morning, please warmly welcome to the front of the stage, Chairperson of the Standing Committee on Public Accounts, Mr. Songezo Zibi.
I didn't hear any ululating there, so let's go. La, 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 la. Thank you. No pressure. Thank you very much, and good morning to all of you. I thought maybe let me start here. That what we are seeing is, in a way the process was designed to work, actually. Except the bit where we stopped the finance minister from presenting the budget at the very last minute, which I had sensed was going to happen because I was in a meeting with the president and the finance minister and the director general and the other leaders in the GNU, and that was in the February budget. And I could tell that there was trouble, in the sense that the consensus that you typically have in cabinet was not there. And we could see in the meeting, because you've got several cabinet ministers in that group, including the leader of the Democratic Alliance, who made clear that they would not be able to support the budget in its form then, and I can see that they're not able to support the budget in its current form either. But it was an unprecedented event where we all said we're going to listen to the finance minister delivering his budget, and then it does not happen. The only thing that I'm really pissed off about is the fact that that tent is damn hot, And we were made to sit there while we were waiting for the finance minister to walk in. Well, actually, I had to pretend I didn't know what was going on because I, I kind of knew that, what was going to happen, but I couldn't tell anybody. And then some of the cabinet ministers came in and they signaled this to me. And I knew at least we could walk out of the sauna and be outside in the sun. But when the election outcome was finalized in June last year, I knew immediately that this process would be a mess because we have never before in South Africa had a government that does not have a majority. It's always been one party. In the democratic era, that's been the ANC. Before that, it was a national party since 1961, and therefore there was no one in South Africa who, in their living memory, had seen a budget where there was no consensus in cabinet, and there was no consensus among the political actors in parliament. So it's always been this process where the finance minister presents his, and they've always been men, presents his budget, and it's taken that it's going to happen because, well, that's how the system works. And everybody, political actors, market actors, have built their assumptions on the smoothness of this process. However, there are instances where you have a political outcome that makes it impossible to assume that is going to be the case. And on this occasion, we do not have a winner. We have the ANC at just over 40%, and it needs the support of other political parties to get things done. And if that support is not there, it becomes difficult. And so what I want to say, first of all, is that this is the new normal. This is the new normal. We must internalize it and accept it. If we don't, we are deluding ourselves. This is going to be the case with budget. It may be the case with various pieces of legislation in future because nobody has a majority. There is an added dynamic in that the second largest party in the country is generally at odds on many things with its alliance partner, with its coalition partner, the two anchor tenants in the government of national unity, that is the African National Congress and the Democratic Alliance. It's very important that we do not become surprised in future. I could see this coming last year. It has come to pass. It will come to pass again. So that is the first thing. The second thing is that, as Isaiah said earlier on, there is always an assumption that the budget is going to pass. And therefore, people have not invested in understanding the process. Actually, the budget takes a hell of a long time to approve. It does. And Dr. Jantjies will tell you that after the tabling, because a minister tables a set of bills in parliament, it's a proposal. So because we are in a investment banking environment here, let me use the analogy of a board. So the citizens are shareholders, cabinet is the exco, parliament is the board. The chief financial officer of the country has tabled a proposal before the board in terms of where the company should go. The board has not yet considered the proposal. It's like that each year. It's just that because of the powerful majority the ANC has always had, people have generally sleepwalked through the process because there was no drama. We must get used to the drama now. So the board is about to deliberate. It is therefore also the time that we get to understand what political risk means. Because given the importance and the risks that the finance minister has to manage, you really start worrying about the quality of that board, don't you? So political outcomes matter. We cannot sleepwalk through elections and look at them parochially. You have, and I will describe the environment globally and locally shortly in my formal remarks, a situation where you need wise, knowledgeable, experienced heads in the board. We don't have an abundance of them. We don't. That's a fact. And that is a problem. And that is why I am saying we must get used to the uncertainty. I'm not trying to scare you. It's a fact. If I don't, I will fail in my responsibility. there is also a culture of those same board members not wanting to accept reality for what it is. One of them is the importance of the fiscal framework and the amount of debt that the country is having to manage versus a stagnant economy and structural reforms that are taking too long and a political culture that is too rooted in ideological dogmas. And therefore it becomes really, really difficult to do the pragmatic things that a country in a position such as ours needs to do in order to grow the economy and lift millions of people out of poverty. You have political actors who believe that it is the right thing to do to be hostile to business, because we're fighting old battles from before 1994 and not understanding that we have to build a political and economic system or ecosystem where there is tension, but there is a maturity to secure some wins together. And that's what we don't have, and that's a political risk. I watch in Parliament, when everybody talks about the budget, they talk about the things they would like to put on the shopping list. They don't want to talk about whether there's money for it or not. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the board that is going to deliberate. But to the process, quickly. These proposals are going to go to two committees in particular, the Standing Committee on Finance and the Standing Committee on Appropriations. They are going to look at the budget in detail, and the political parties will make their contributions. At the end of that long process, those committees will write a report and deliver it to the House. So on that day, and I encourage you if you can, and I know we're busy, you need to watch the proceedings. The first person who stands up to speak is not the Minister of Finance. It is the chairperson of that portfolio committee. They are then followed by the various political parties in terms of the time allocated for them to speak in Parliament, to say what their views are, and then the Minister of Finance eventually rises to respond to what has been tabled to the House. And then you get a vote. That will happen in June. That's how the process works. We have a two-stage budgeting process in South Africa. That thing most of us don't care about that takes place in October, the mini-budget, the medium-term budget policy statement, is incredibly important because we've got 3-year budgeting cycles. It brings predictability to this process in February. It also makes sure that you cannot have a government shutdown such as we have in the United States. It also enables people like Isaah and Roy to do their jobs with a bit more certainty. Otherwise, this thing would be like a Christmas present, where you wait until February to hear what the finance minister is going to say, and you try and read what kind of tie he's wearing, whether he's smiling or not, to try and understand what's going to happen, and then it lands, and you're like, oh no. I nearly said OSH1T. So it's important to understand that this is how the process works. I must also say I became a little bit concerned yesterday when I saw the finance minister's tie, which was very busy. And welcome, Hilary, which was very busy. And I thought, I hope this does not mean like we are going to have a mess on our hands when you finally get up to speak. So it's very important that we follow this process very closely, in particular, the committee proceedings, because they are going to produce the report that goes to the National Assembly. Otherwise, today, tomorrow, next week, and so on, the government continues to function. There is, however, a problem with this, and you probably know this better than I do. When you change the environment, in other words, you change the order of things, the way they've run before, and you don't explain it, it causes a problem for the markets because people believe there is a crisis. I discussed this with the Minister of Finance and with the Director General a couple of days before the budget. And I said, the days when the Treasury spoke twice a year in October and in February are over. There needs to be active management of information and market players in order to make sure that people understand what is going to happen. But in October, there was an amendment to the February budget. There is every year. And that amendment takes us a couple of months over so that this process can happen. So there is not going to be a shutdown, not anytime soon. Even when it appears that the consensus is taking too long, the finance minister has got some procedural tools in the toolbox. He may table 2 appropriation bills, as I suggested to him that he does now already. One is of all the stuff that has already been agreed upon, so that we bank that and there's no uncertainty. Then we contend with the new stuff that we're fighting about, which is about 252 billion over 3 years. So there are things like that that can be done in order to make sure that we manage through the process. So I'm now going to leave that because I think I've taken up enough time. I wanted to speak for an hour and a half, and Isaiah said I couldn't. So I'm only going to speak for an hour. Hopefully none of you will fall asleep. But ladies and gentlemen, we live in unprecedented times. The world and our country are not the same places we lived in just 12 months ago. We had a powerful majority in government in the form of the ANC. We no longer do. We could pass budgets in our sleep. Now it's complicated and fractious. The US economy was cooking, with a president singularly focused on rebuilding its core capacities to get ready for the modern age. Now there is a president hell-bent on destroying it, with grave consequences for the global economy and for the stability of the world as a whole. The US was at the center of what is known as the Western world. Now it is decoupling fast and in a chaotic manner. The trade and political bonds between North America, in the central North America, in the form of Mexico, the US, Canada, and so on, and Western Europe and Southeast Asia can no longer be taken for granted. So the first thing I want to say this morning is that we all need to re-examine all our previous assumptions. When I saw RMB's, the beginning of RMB's, one of your notes that Isaiah sent me before the abortive meeting that we tried to have, I looked at the first couple of pages and they were already irrelevant. And Donald Trump made sure they were irrelevant. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't your fault. I could understand that it was written at the tail end of Joe Biden's presidency, and therefore you couldn't have known exactly how bad it was going to be. But in that time, I'm sure you looked at that same note and you thought, should we withdraw it and write a new one? But then you need to do that every day. The point I'm making is that every policymaker and market actor must now accept constant uncertainty as an integral part of the terrain in which they have to make decisions. This is as true of the global environment as it is of South Africa itself. I had coffee with the Reserve Bank governor some weeks ago, and I asked him if they yet know how to understand and price the environment we're getting into. And that was a week into the Trump presidency. He said to me, anybody who claims they know is not telling you the truth. You need information, you need some predictability, you need to kind of understand what people are going to do, and then you can put a number on it and build models. You can't in this case. When you can have 3 different tariff orders within 24 hours in the US, then you know we live in dizzying times. But the imperative is to never get dizzy, instead to be dynamic and adaptable and to build resilience. I will return to this point in our South African context later. I'm not going to bore you with economic analysis. Isaiah and his colleagues are sufficiently well versed in these matters and they can speak on them. I will, however, speak about the political economy and why political structures, political outlook, and political institutions have such a profound influence on economic outcomes. South Africa is undergoing a profound political transition. We are not likely to have an election that produces a clear majority for some time, possibly 2, 3, or 4 elections in the future. The contestation we see over the budget will happen again because the anchor tenants of the GNU, as I said earlier, the ANC and the DA, have many things they do not see eye to eye on. In any event, South Africa hasn't had a coalition government in the democratic era, and so unlike Belgium or Germany or Austria or the Netherlands, there is no culture of coalitions that political actors can lean on in times such as this. things are going to be a little rough for some time, introducing further uncertainty into the system. Both the president and John Steenhuisen navigate internal party dynamics that often complicate rather than empower their respective parties' participation in the GNU. And to give you a little bit of color, there are people in the ANC who have not internalized that the party has lost a majority. I speak to them, but that's not the only problem. The DA has similar problems of its own, in that there are people with delusional expectations of what their cabinet ministers can achieve. For example, cabinet always has to act as a body. There is no such a thing as a DA minister and a DA decision in the context of cabinet. You have to get your colleagues in cabinet to back your decision, to back your recommendations. And you know why? Because ultimately you end up in parliament and you're going to need people to show hands. It is unwise to believe that you can go off on your own and make decisions. And one of the things I've said to my colleagues and I've said to the president, one of the most important things for the economy and for South Africa's stability is the ability to achieve cohesion in cabinet. But there are constantly players who sit at the top of echelons of both political parties who are not in the GNU, who keep sniping and throwing javelins and other things into the process and accusing them of selling out. That's a problem. It's a political risk. It's an economic risk. The job of the president in this respect becomes a heck of a lot tougher because you're not acting or working with a cohesive group of people who sit in the same political structures, have known each other for years, and they generally understand and finish one another's sentences. Well, actually, the ANC hasn't had that tendency in a long time in any event. The point I want to make here is that having a complex coalition arrangement at a time when political and economic reforms are urgently needed is an enormous challenge. Not only does it need strong consensus in cabinet, it also needs cohesion in parliament. We have complications on both scores right now, and it may be a while before things settle down for the longer term. And I really, really do hope things settle down for the good of everyone. I have known the finance minister for many years. He once famously said to Sam Kokeli, who's sitting here, and I will not say it exactly the way he is, that he's a committed communist. He's such a committed communist that he is read everywhere. But he mentioned a part of his body that I won't mention. But I have also known him to be pragmatic and prepared to change his mind. I am certain that many of you wouldn't really accuse him of carrying out a communist agenda in cabinet in his role as finance minister, and that's pragmatism. But the first thing to acknowledge is that he is managing a lemon in the South African economy and fiscal policy. After years of careful mismanagement and committed destruction of South Africa's institutions under the Jacob Zuma government, there was a naive expectation that things could be arrested and turned around quickly. This could not be. Political institutions are notoriously difficult to turn around because they are powerful political and other stakeholders with vested interests who exercise political pressure to slow down or even stop the change. For example, when Eskom chair Mteto Nyati complained that there were instances where Eskom was paying a premium to middlemen in the name of BEE while the entity was struggling to stay afloat, he was pilloried as an enemy of transformation and plastered in the front of newspapers. But it is unconscionable that Eskom must pay prices that other commercial entities never have to pay. This is a tough conversation that all of the actors involved must engage with, because these are some of the things that weigh us down. And we create problems elsewhere by saying, well, we need to rescue Eskom to X amount when it could be Y amount. But it needs political will. It needs political consensus. It needs political maturity. It needs political strength. The second example. The transformation of Eskom's coal transport system from road to rail produces losers in the form of truck operators who engage in political lobbying all the way through to parliament. The same dynamic exists for Transnet. The decline in its capacity has produced a booming road freight industry. But when you begin to fix that problem, you are going to produce losers who feel hard done by. In some instances, you have actors who are not averse to engaging in criminal acts to ensure that their economic opportunity is sustained. And that's the reality of the country in which we operate. And sometimes these people have political cover, like the extortion gangs who can stop trucks down the N3 and so on. To deal with these problems, you need a strong government with a powerful mandate. We don't have it right now and likely won't have it anytime soon. I'm not saying this to depress anyone, just saying we must manage our expectations because change needs resolve and a level of political recklessness. Otherwise, it almost never happens. And I must say Jacob Zuma could engage in political recklessness a lot. I'm not suggesting we do the same, but sometimes you've got to take political risks, such as tabling a budget even when you don't have consensus in cabinet, so that you force people to come out of their shells and say, this is what I no longer want in the budget, and I will expend my political capital in order to drive that outcome. Right now, what we've had before, where everything was a done deal, is that people have been able to pontificate from their seats without ever having to take the political consequences for their choices, and complain and complain and complain. Those days are over. Somebody is going to need to stand up in parliament and say, I disagree with the public sector wage bill. It's going to cost 35 billion over 3 years. We don't have that kind of money. So it's important sometimes that you bring maturity into the process. It's painful. It's annoying, I know, but we kind of need to do it. So we must observe and track the attitudes and actions of every minister, premier, and mayor to understand what is going to be done and how fast it will be done. Let me move on to this budget. I agree with the BR. This budget has little in it by way of significant growth-enhancing measures. But that is a factor of the political decisions we have taken over the years. In 2009, and I remember very well, I worked in the mining industry at the time. I worked for Extrata, which no longer exists. And Extrata was trying to take over Lonmin PLC, like 4 days before the bottom fell out of the financial markets. And that decision just became more and more and more and more toxic over a number of days and weeks. It was a complicated environment. But in 2009, President Motlanthe, after the removal of Thabo Mbeki, announced a plus 740 billion rand package for investment in infrastructure as a response to the Great Recession of 2008. That set off the feeding frenzy we now know as state capture. We overpaid for power stations and bought Chinese locomotives that were never received. Today, the sovereign balance sheet is laden with debt that has grown from 1.7 trillion in 2014 to about 5.4 trillion right now. In that time, we've had very little to show for it. GDP per capita has reversed. The debt burden on every working South African has grown from 70,000 to 114,000. We've got higher unemployment, high levels of poverty, high inequality. What I'm trying to say is that political decisions and political actors matter. The choices that would otherwise have to be made to put more money in national, regional, and local infrastructure are politically toxic. There is a 35 billion rand for an above-inflation wage increase. There is also 35 billion meant for the SRD grant. We cannot touch those, otherwise July 2021 would look like a picnic. So there are tough decisions to be made, but nobody is going to use their political capital to solve them. What I'm trying to say is everybody looks at the finance minister. To do what exactly? When the political actors in the system do not want to spend their political capital. Because of this crunch, we are beginning to see more and more people proposing that we dip into public servants' pensions. In Parliament last week, the other day, an ANC MP proposed that we liquidate about 500 billion of the PIC's holdings, much of which is the GPF's money, in order to fund economic growth. Of course, a massive sell-off such as this would tank the JSC, the value of the PIC's own holdings, and the critical role the PIC plays in transforming the economy. The same people would complain that too much of the economy is in white hands, while also forgetting that this money must be returned. It's not a gift. A situation such as this produces magic bullets. That is why countries, I'll mention a country in West Africa, I won't mention their name, but they've got a high proliferation of prophets and apostles and so on. That's the environment you produce when a society feels that it is in a rut. People look for miracles, and there's no shortage of merchants to offer those miracles. I believe that there are several things we can do, that we must do to kickstart growth in South Africa over and above the work already done. Several. I hope I didn't say 3. The first is leadership. I know it's trite. I know it's trite. It's abstract. But what we need is cohesion in cabinet. What we need are political actors in the form of the president and John Steenhuisen and others to be able to say to their colleagues, I'm sorry, do what you must, but this decision has to go ahead. And force people to come out. If we don't have that, it's going to be difficult. The second is to identify some of the great transformations that will lift the boots, choking the economy itself. One of the examples is to radically transform the freight rail industry and open a bid window for private train operators within this financial year. The problem that we have, and I see it in Parliament and in other political discussions, no privatization becomes an issue. I'm like, okay, colleagues, the government doesn't own every car that runs on the road, and it's not a problem. So why do you have a problem with rail? What am I missing? What am I missing? Okay, if you want to take a flight, you choose. Fly SAFE, SAA, etc. You want to take a bus, you choose. You want to take Uber, Bolt, take Uber, Bolt, or whatever. You gotta choose, right? And nobody has a problem with this system. But when you come to public goods in the form of rail, no, you can't do that. And yet, MPC after MPC, the Reserve Bank tries to find more direct language to say, unless we fix electricity, not just the supply thereof and the reliability thereof, but the price over time, because you want to achieve electricity price competitiveness over time, so that you can lower and manage input costs for operators in the economy. But when it comes to Transnet, it's a problem. When it comes to PRASA, it's a problem. So we rely on the fiscus, which must produce the tens and hundreds of billions that you need in order to do this work. I asked Barbara Creasy in Parliament, in our committee, how much PRASA and Transnet need in order to meet their basic mandate. In other words, to go back to pre-COVID levels, let's say 2015, 2016. And she said about 120 billion rand each. The government doesn't have that kind of money. But you have politicians who are not honest with the South African people to say sorry. But this radical transformation, I know the lead times would be longish, but you could start seeing actual investment at about 15 to 24 months' time coming through. But cabinet needs to have the political will and not engage in long, nebulous conversations within. The second is in transforming key local government nodes for economic recovery and growth. In fact, I think for about 5 years, we must find the constitutional instrument to place those under administration. To place those under administration. I used to work in Rustenburg. It's a critical economic node for the Northwest and for the country. It is in a mess. If you look at all the towns in which the agri-sector is rooted, oh my God, you don't want to live there. You don't want to run a business there. And so we place this burden on businesses to subsidize the failures at local government level. I really believe if you focused on mining, you focused on tourism, you focused on agri, you focused on services, and you focus on 15 to 18 municipalities out of this mess, you can begin to build a political institutional base where the economy can begin to grow. The third is in the area of modern tertiary skills. I know fee-free education is really important for many people in South Africa so they can access tertiary education, especially talented people. But we leave the outcomes to chance. We leave the outcomes to chance. One of the things the Chinese were absolutely committed to do was to take their best and brightest to Western universities to learn and come back to China and uplift the Chinese economy. It's long-term thinking. The days of thinking the reason China is so great is low labor costs are gone. They've got more technologies per capita than anybody else, notwithstanding the size of their population. But we're always queasy about making very specific interventions in the economy because we may be said to be supporting just a few. The last point I want to make, and I've got many points to make, but there will be chance. The last point I want to make is really about the importance of trying to secure support for tough decisions beyond just the political actors themselves. I spoke earlier about the risks associated with the board of SA Inc. You also need in our political craft to be able to generate points of pressure coming from outside. One of my serious gripes with my former colleagues in business is that everybody is happy to assist ministers and so on, never to assist Parliament. And yet Parliament is the board. I don't understand it. I do not understand it. We now have a budget that is sitting with Parliament, facing enormous risk. And I think in our hearts we know one of the biggest problems is that not enough people in that body may understand the risks they're dealing with and the importance of the things that they say must be done and the need to make actual choices and the need to prioritize. One of the things we've built is a culture that serves the executive, that thinks the executive is the only place where action happens. And therefore business isolates itself from the rest of society, aligns with politicians who usually have credibility problems in general anyway. And therefore never have the support when harmful proposals get placed on the table. I can tell you, mark my words, there will be lots of proposals that you must increase corporate income taxes in this process. I am not aware of any company that has a net profit margin north of 10%. And in order to plug the hole, we would need about 9 percentage points increase in corporate income taxes. There is no room to do that. We will tank the economy again. And we leave this to the finance minister alone. And actors in business don't engage with parliamentary processes at all. I thank you.
Thank you. I almost feel as though we need to let it sink in just a little further. But Mr. Zibi, you've given us amazing insight here this morning, and I am encouraged by the fact that we have an opportunity for you to join us in a panel discussion as we look to elaborate so much deeper into many of these factors. There's a lot that we have to consider. I think you all agree with me that it goes beyond the numbers, but also understanding the dynamics that we operate in locally, but also at a global level, but even more so the concerted effort that we also need to apply in being participants within the parliamentary process and the arena of really rebuilding our economy. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take this opportunity not only to invite Mr. Zibi back up on stage, but also have him be joined by several panelists who will join us in conversation to really help us get some analysis and perspective as we think budget this morning. So on that note, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to welcome back on stage Mr. Songezo Zibi, who will be joining us in this particular panel discussion. He will not be alone. I'm going to introduce all the speakers with a very brief background of their bio, following which, once they are all up on stage, that's when I'll kindly request that we welcome them with a warm set of applause. We'll also be joined by a person who plays a very prominent and pertinent role within the Parliamentary Budget Office, essentially helping us understand the process that will be implemented going forward, where the hard work really starts now, getting some clarity with regard to the agreements and even more so the disagreements that might take place within the approval of the budget. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome as well to the front who will be joining us Professor Dumisani, Jantjies, Director of the Parliamentary Budget Office. He'll be followed by a very familiar name and face and voice when it comes to all things economics. Having worked and played experience at National Treasury, advising presidency as well with regard to key economic outcomes, but also policies that need to be implemented, currently takes care of a very important think hub right now that offers research and consults with different entities. He is a senior economist at Impumelelo Growth Lab, the Bureau for Economic Research, Dr. Roy Havemann, who joins us now on stage. And of course, it wouldn't be a conversation on all things economics without one of our favorite faces and voices in the world of economics, not only because of the insight and detail that he's able to share, but a phenomenal leader who has served in multiple roles within different institutions to offer some economic detail and clarity into the plethora of information that we need to distill. Welcome back on stage, Mr. Isaah Mhlanga, Chief Economist of RMB. Please warmly welcome them all on stage, ladies and gentlemen. I'm tempted to ask the audience first, how are you feeling after that keynote before I speak to the panelists? Anxious, right? Any other feelings in that can be expressed? Oh. True to South African form. Yeah. Well, this is the interaction that we're going to keep and maintain, because this is why we have this panel discussion that's going to take place. An opportunity for us to really reflect on the anxiety that we're feeling, the frustration, the uncertainty, and how all of this just convolutes the environment within which we are challenged to actually make key decisions in. Now, I must tell you, as I was sitting listening to Songezo, for a moment I thought, I need to rework my questions because this was not part of the brief. But you've really given us an opportunity as South Africans to sit and fully absorb this new environment that we're in. When we walked in this morning, I joked that it's been a while since we haven't spoken about Donald Trump first thing in the morning. But despite Trump, it's quite clear that we also have our own challenges that we need to contend with as South Africans. So, over the next about 45 minutes, we're going to indulge in this panel discussion to get some feedback on the themes that Mr. Zibi's highlighted, but also outcomes on the budget. But most importantly, it's to ensure that when you leave here, you feel a lot more empowered to make the right decisions and to approach this volatile environment with the right tool set and skills going forward for the decisions you need to make. A reminder that we will be taking questions at some point, so there will be a roving mic available to you here in the room, and of course to those who are joining us virtually, you'll be able to share your questions and they'll be shared with us here. I think it is quite pertinent, before we get to the processes and understand many of the key themes, that we do just very briefly reflect on the outcomes of the budget speech. Much has been said, and depending on who you speak to, some quarters are happy, other quarters are not so happy. And Roy, having read just the headline of your newsletter this morning, saying, well, this has been a very interesting budget, one of compromises, but not really providing the growth that we need, and fundamentally just seeing an increase in taxes. Very briefly, just for us to have some context, let's get some perspective from you with regard to the budget speech and your overall reaction to the numbers.
Yes, so if you look at the in-year spending increases, the gross increases before they draw down on reserves and so forth, originally in the budget 1.0 that was 108 billion, just this financial year. They revised it down to 102 billion. So that shows you what small adjustments they actually made from a spending perspective between budget 1.0 and budget 2.0.
And highlight that because that's an issue of contention, right? When it comes to spending, expenditure has been the frustration that we've actually been expressing for quite some time.
Absolutely. So if you're spending, then you draw down on your contingency reserves and all of that, and that's what leaves you circa the 60 billion that has to be found from tax increases. And that's really the question, right? Is if you start there, and you take it down to 60 billion, you need to do something. You need to either raise VAT or you need to raise personal income tax. But because you're starting with this big expenditure increase, your only options then are either to obviously increase borrowing or to increase taxes. One of our Generation Z people at work said, this budget is not budgeting. And I think she was completely right. This budget isn't budgeting. You know, when you or I are faced with less revenue, or we look at our income over the next year, and then we make a decision on how much we're going to spend, what car are we going to buy, what house are we going to buy, what clothes are we going to buy. We cut our spending to suit what we're getting in.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem as though that's really been what. So that's, I guess, the disappointment, is that the answer to all the questions is an increase in taxes. And then we all know what we really need to do is increase economic growth. And the Minister was very good at summarizing, I think, the excellent progress of Operation Vulindlela 1.0, really good summary of some very good things that have happened. But I think, as Honourable Zibi said this morning in the address, we're not seeing the progress on the Transnet rail reforms. We're not really seeing progress on the ports reforms yet. There's been some talk about it, but we haven't quite seen it yet. And we were hoping for some tangible results on that, and we didn't see that.
Disappointing compromise, as you
Yes.
say. Isaah, you're also the numbers guy, so quite keen to get your feedback and perspective here with post the budget. Happy, unhappy, caught in the middle somewhere.
But there are two perspectives. So the first one is to look at the fiscal framework, at least from a borrowing perspective, that was maintained. So whatever the difference is between the political players, they seem to have understood that we need to keep our borrowing where they are, at least where they have been projected to be at the MTBPS and also at the budget 1.0, which wasn't tabled. So that's a good outcome from a market's perspective. No new borrowings, because you can't simply sustain the level of debt servicing costs given the economy that is not growing where it should be. Which then brings me to the next, a different perspective, which is the actions that are required for us to lift economic growth. That, for me, I think is a bit of a disappointment. We didn't get a bold enough action plan, perhaps by design. National Treasury isn't responsible for what happens in the sectors where growth should come from. Their job is to budget, but that budget must then produce the actions in the different sectors. To Mr. Zibi's point earlier on, what needs to happen in logistics, in energy, and all the other sectors. And that is not within the mandate of the Treasury. So in the frustrations that we have because of lack of growth, we tend to point all those frustrations to the person that delivers the budget. But so little frustrations are pointed at the leaders that are actually supposed to make the change in the sectors where growth is going to come from. So maybe I would say we are disappointed by design because the budget is tabled by the finance minister and we don't see other ministers in the same way.
100%. Such a valid point that you mentioned, and perhaps that's where we do need to get into the nitty-gritty of understanding some of these levers that do need to be pulled to create and stimulate that growth, but also understand how the budget needs to budget and the money needs to make sense. Professor Jantjies, maybe this is a good way to segue to come to you for just a moment, and perhaps building up on what Honourable Zibi has mentioned, and happy to get both of your thoughts in this regard, especially with in terms of the office that you take control of.
Yep.
As you mentioned to me earlier this morning, this is where the hard work starts. And fundamentally, as it's been described by the keynote, this is essentially where the process does fundamentally begin to ensure that we get a better understanding of whether or not this budget will be accepted, but also how the numbers will essentially be allocated by different key players and parties. Remind us, for those who perhaps might not be familiar with the importance of the role and function that your office serves.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I want to first quickly start by commenting, give input about the budget as well, and then I'll come into the details. I think the way we look at the budget as a budget office is really from the perspective of what it's meant to do. And I think for us it's important when you start from the SONA, State of National Address, is set out clear priorities in terms of where we want to be as a country, or at least MTDP, which has not yet been put out there. And we use that as a lens from which we look at the budget. And we feel that's how, at least from the legislative perspective, we should look at the budget, because that's what Honourable Zibi, when they get appointed or voted in, people want to see those things being improved in society. And I think that's the biggest important dynamic in our view, that at a lot of times we find that we look at the budget from the rents and cents and balance and all of that. It's not useful in a more outcome-based thinking, which Parliament should be. And I think when we look at it from that perspective, you see that the budget did try to address some of the commitments in the SONA at least, but it was really difficult balancing to do, particularly when you think about cost of living, dealing with inequality. Some of the proposals are like to fly through the proposed targets or the priorities that are set out in that perspective. And I think that's what we will be presenting next week, Tuesday, to say how is this budget really, because it allows us to understand what are different stakeholders' role, particularly investors, what role they can play into the space. I mean, one of the exciting things I picked up is the issue of infrastructure development. It's a very big space which, in my view, it crowds in private investors. It's supposed to be, and I think more detailed around that. Of course, it's below the 10% NDP target, 5%, I think 5% over the medium term, but it's something that we have not seen for time. But also, investment, human capital, social protection is a very important aspect of it. And I think those are dynamics from my perspective. Yes, we are all concerned about the way the tax will really suppress demand, from the weaker side. So that's in a high level what I'll look at, but from where it's supposed to, what it's supposed to do and reflect on the budget in holistically. The budget office role is really to advise Mr. Zibi and his colleagues in terms of some of those areas, to say these are the areas that we need to consider if you are going to realize midterm development strategies that you've adopted. And in our perspective, we think budget plays an important role. There's timelines where we also guide them and say, look, we only have 16 days from yesterday to adopt fiscal framework. Otherwise, you have space to go beyond that, but you have to stick within that 16 days, which is likely to see the amendments, if I think about what I've heard over time. I mean, listen to Mr. Zibi's speech as well. So that's what we do, advise in that context, but more importantly, on the content a lot than the process itself.
And I think this is an important aspect to actually address, just in terms of the detail of that content, if you are at liberty just to give us a little bit more context, because as you say, this actually plays a significant role within the development, growth and strategies that we implement in the country in order to expand the tax base, grow the economy, and address many of the themes and concerns that typically exist. Help us contextualize, I guess, how the structure works, because it's not just advice that is just plain black and white. There's options. There's a wide spread of variations that you actually look into. Help us contextualize what that has looked like of late, especially given the new structure of cabinet.
Yes, I think one of the things I could probably easily talk about is the advice we gave before the budget relates to the options around revenue. What are options are available? Because we were asked by the Finance Committee to say, look, we see this debate around VAT. Please give us options. Are there other options that we as Parliament could propose back to the executive if there isn't consensus around VAT? And it was quite interesting that we said, we'll look at it, but we'll have to be protected because they aren't going to be a holy cow. We'll touch everything in that regard. And we did look at what would be the implications of VAT increase. In particular, we said, look, if you look at 2%, it was then discussed, you would like to generate, I think, 50 billion or so. But thinking about the tax system having to be more progressive as a whole, maybe you need to consider other options beyond VAT because of its nature of being more regressive. So we looked at other opportunities, other potentials. We did look at wealth tax. I need to be protected here. Wealth tax to say, are you able to raise revenue in other areas and so on. It was a very interesting debate, and when we listen to members discussing that, it helps a lot because when they have debates, they're having debate on content, on factual, rather than just being a political discussion. So I think it's very useful in that sense.
Maybe let me add a bit. Listening to Prof here, I get a sense that the options that were put to parliamentarians are actually the wrong options to look at. It's a revenue discussion. But South Africa does not have a revenue problem. Yet that was the central discussion in terms of what revenue options do we have. If you look at total tax to GDP ratio in time, we are at the highest level we've ever been in the history that we have data, which then tells us that actually revenue is not a problem. This economy is able to extract as much revenue even if it's growing at less than 1%, which it has over the last 2 years. Yet, tax revenue to GDP ratio has continued to rise. What we have is an expenditure problem in terms of the quality of that spending and what it implies for GDP growth. So we're spending a lot on much of what has very low multipliers, which essentially mean for every R1 we spend, how much economic growth we have. So much of our spending is in areas that gives us low multipliers. That's where the options and much of the discussions should happen in the parliamentarian space, not a revenue discussion.
100%.
Yes, we see SARS has been given 3.5 billion and 4 billion over the medium term thereafter to try and generate efficiencies in tax collections. That's well and good, and I'm sure we are going to get more. But without talking about the expenditure side, to Roy's point earlier on, if you look at budget 1.0 and then 2.0, the revisions to the expenditure was minuscule, which means it's not even a consideration to a large extent. That's where the debate has to be.
So maybe let's continue to build up on that, just understanding where can we continue to cut the fat when it comes to the budget, and most importantly, a build up to it. Is the conversation happening? How do we need to continue to push and drive for that political will, as you've mentioned, Mr. Zibi?
So cutting the fat takes time. I think it's important for people to realize in government it takes time, because sometimes there's legislation that forces you to do that. So for example, you can take a decision in your mind that municipality X does not have the capacity to manage the finances it gets from the government. The constitution says the municipality must get that money. That's why my proposal was put it under administration. You can't not give it to them. You understand? So the reforms that will get you to efficiency and making the biggest savings take time, right? However, there are things you can do in the short term. They just usually deliver chump change, right? They usually deliver chump change because it's in the discretion of a minister and so on. And secondly, their stakeholders are invested. Let me give an example. The DA has proposed that just get rid of the sitters because they waste money and so on, and a lot of them actually just are a headache. I chair the committee that looks at the expenditure. Here's a problem. You can't take the skills levy taken from employers and give it to the police.
Tell us why.
The law doesn't allow you to do that. There's a National Skills Act. It says if you're going to take this money from employers, you've got to use it for skills development in this way.
Then
So
should that
you
not
have
be the
to go to
challenge perhaps
parliament.
for us to look at changing legislation in
No,
certain
that's
aspects?
that's
to
why I'm
focus on-
saying it
Got
takes
you.
time. You can't get the finance minister saying, I hereby abolish sitters today, and it happens tomorrow. You can't. So what I'm trying to say is I understand we've got to do these things. I have actually already received the underlying spreadsheets of the expenditure reviews the Treasury has done going back to 2013. They're going to come to the committee in April, May, once the initial phase of the parliamentary process over the budget is done, to present areas. And I can give some examples, for instance. I've spoken about the fact that the government sometimes pays up to 45% premium on property rentals.
Yep.
Why? Why would you do that? As an example, I've spoken about water losses. The city of Tshwane alone loses nearly $750 million a year to water leakage. Now, again, you can pass an edict and say you shall lose no more water. You have to find the damn leaks and plug them. You have to find the people who are stealing the water and deal with them and so on. So again, it takes time. So what I'm trying to say is I understand, I'm irritated with this because I have people sitting in front of me in parliament, time after time, week after week, wasting money. But I also understand there are laws. That's why I said earlier, we have a political problem. People don't want to make the tough political choices. People don't want to make the tough political choices and implement them now so that we can see an outcome down the line. So, of course, there are things that can be done. There are many, but let's just not think it's a silver bullet.
Got you. Professor Havemann, you might have a different perspective on this one, just in terms of some of the solutions and the options that are there.
Completely agree. I think there is definitely I was saying earlier to our discussion, the one thing we've discovered as a country is understanding what 30 billion rand is. I think we previously, it was this vague concept. It's a very big number. We now know it's 1 percentage point in VAT. And so we know that if we want to get 2 percentage points in VAT, we can actually even reduce VAT. we need to find 60 billion in savings, and CETAs are a very good example, and a very good example what I think actually the system is designed to be able to achieve, which is, as Honourable Zibi said in his address in the beginning, you have an M2UPS, which sets out your 3-year spending projections. What you then do is you say then in the 3rd year, the skills development levy will have been redirected to another option, and that's in the budget. And that means by the 3rd year, if in 3 years' time, if the department hasn't passed the required or hasn't brought the required legislation to Parliament, then we're sorry, you were given 3 years to do this, but that's why we have a medium-term planning framework so that we can plan over the medium term.
Exactly, got you. Sounds like this makes your job a lot more frustrating, Dr. Jantjies.
Yes, it is.
Or challenging.
But more exciting. But I think I had not finished my point before as I came in. So what we did, we actually look at both the revenue and spending side of things. But I think what we had to do, what we're trying to do also is to say, what has been the evidence of the past 15 years? We've had fiscal consolidation over the past 15 years or so, which was largely around cutting spending. And there's a clear correlation, at least not causation, but correlation between, you see, a lack of growth over the same period of time, growth in unemployment, and a widening inequality and socioeconomic development changes over time. So then, in a way, I said to you earlier on, when you look at the SONA priorities, are trying, in a way, to try to reverse such developmental trajectory. So, yes, I agree, you need to deal with efficiencies, but I think you have to recognize the importance of needing to invest in some of this area, education, and so many, but largely to try to reverse the trajectory over time. And not enough efficiency, not amount of efficiency will get us to that trajectory. We need to be honest and recognize we need to invest as a country, crowd in private investment by spending these areas, which in itself will create employment. When you look at education, for example, if you need to build more schools, that means more construction companies in localized areas are able to participate in the space and get more people employed in a short time, whatever, but you're able to create economic activities. And for me, expenditure problem is a lot to do with more investments rather than cutting spending. But yes, we need to address efficiencies. Definitely, I agree with that part.
Can I, again, it's not a targeted response.
Got you. you are protected.
But I think we need to characterize how we have managed our spending over the last 15 years appropriately. There has not been fiscal consolidation in the last 15 years. And a very simple way to look at that is to look at our primary budget balance. We ran a primary budget balance for the first time since 2006, 2007, last year. Then you could say, in real terms, perhaps spending have been slowing down. But if you look at actual spending, it has been rising continuously. If you go back before the global financial crisis, we got used to a phrase that goes something like a counter-fiscal policy.
Counter-cyclical.
Yeah, counter-cyclical fiscal policy. That died with the financial crisis. It was never in the budget thereafter. And that essentially means when the economy is not growing, you use fiscal policy to spend a little bit more to give it a boost. But when the economy is growing, government spending has to retreat and allow the private sector to drive growth. That was never the case post the financial crisis. So we respond to economic shocks by increasing spending, but when the economy recovers, we don't reverse that, we continue to increase spending. That has been the characteristics of how fiscal policy has been for the last 15 years until post-COVID, where we're starting to see a bit of this restraint coming through. And that is because the bond market is telling us that, hang on, you have borrowed too much and we're starting to get worried about your ability to pay back the money. And that has also been affirmed by credit rating agencies that have downgraded us to sub-investment grade. There is no way rating agencies would have downgraded us to sub-investment grade if we have done fiscal consolidation. So that tells us we have never been in a fiscal consolidation phase in the last 15 years until very recently post-COVID.
And from what I'm hearing from you, it's something that we need to implement very quickly, but of course we understand that these things do take time and do need to be considered, because at the same time, in as much as we do want to bolster the level of investment that we have in the country, we also need to be primarily focused on ensuring that we don't hurt the consumer environment, which of course has come to the fore in terms of the VAT increases and further non-adjustments, especially when it comes to pay-as-you-earn tax or individual tax, personal income tax. I do want us to delve into those themes in just a moment, but I think I've kept the audience quiet for a bit too long, and many of you have been sharing your thoughts through the expressions that we've heard and a few questions that have also come through online. Happy to gauge if there are any questions that are present here in the room for the moment. We're happy to take at least 2 at a time, just to make sure that we are able to get them with as much feedback as possible. We've got one at the back as to help us out, and second question in the front. Happy to take a second round of questions as well, just to make sure that you all warm up, because maybe we're comfortable for you to take it there. I think our panelists are keen and eager. Sam, you can go ahead, sir.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone, and thanks to the panel and everyone for making this informative. Please, a bit of education on the process itself. What happens now? When does the financial year start? Can the government spend how much, until when? Okay. Who votes in parliament? How many votes? Please, education for me. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Sam. We'll take the second question as well, just to group them together and then address them. I presume the first question is definitely for you, Professor Jantjies. In the meantime, more than happy for you to simmer with your questions, and we'll address them in the second round.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion. I'm intrigued by the conversation between the professor and Isaah.
That was a 4-way conversation.
I will have to be there.
And I'm hearing 2 different schools of thought. Where is the disconnect? Why aren't you guys sitting together somewhere and aligned? I think this is where I think public and private can come together. But I'm just interested to learn where is the disconnect, between the two of you, because you both like raising important points. But I hear Isaah saying, "I've got the stats. I've been looking at this, and I think we're looking at the wrong problem." And I'm hearing Professor saying, "No, we do look at both, but we've got more room to get more money." And I think Isaah is saying, "No, you don't have that room anymore. Look at your expenses," which is what I think ordinary people on a daily basis do. Thank you.
100%. Thank you so much. Maybe that's a good one to start with and lead on then from there to the process, but of course open to all of the panelists. But let's discuss this even further. That frustration in terms of the breakdown regarding whether to focus on pulling at more levers regarding revenue versus fiscal consolidation, as well as cutting back on expenditure. Where is the breakdown? Isaah?
Yeah. Maybe let me give the Prof a little bit of an olive branch here.
I like that.
It's true, we need more teachers, we need more nurses, we need more doctors in our public healthcare facilities and all the other social services. That's true if you look on a per capita basis relative to other countries. But then we also have to look at what sort of quality of that service that we are getting if we are adding this capacity in the public sector. We haven't had much of the discussion of the quality. Let's take education as an example. If you look at education outcomes, they are terrible. Grade 3 learners, grade 4 learners can't read for meaning. There are international surveys that gives us that. So yes, we can add more teachers, but that does solve, do we solve that education outcome problem by adding more teachers? So maybe we need to look at the quality in addition to capacitating the state. I'm just singling out the education as one example where we need to look at both capacity, which is adding more teachers, but what quality do we get out of that? So the quality of spending, we haven't done much look in terms of the quality of spending.
As you mentioned that, my mind automatically goes to NHI and of course the healthcare space, right? And of course the issues of contention that exist in that regard as well, even though as we know that also is taking time in terms of legislation. But open to you,
Sure, I think I was supposed to have answered the process question earlier, but I think
we'll come to that in a moment because
yes, no, I think when you look at the February budget, that budget one, you call it budget one, yeah, point one. When you look at the spending that was proposed, you could see that by 2027, 2028, you would still see a real decline. The spending per capita by that time would be far lower than the one we've had even 2017 or so financial year. That is a point in adding to what he's saying. Definitely we've seen a real decline in spending on some of these social key issues. But the other issue that has made way for fiscal consolidation over the past 15 years, it's a reduction in infrastructure spending. We've seen a way reduction in infrastructure spend because you can't see it with your eyes, but in real sense, we're not able to create employment and growth largely because we've not really invested a lot over time, tried to reach primary balance, try to reach a certain level of debt and so on. That's what I mean. I'm saying we've not seen that a lot, and definitely we need to reverse that if we're going to see growth. But also one of the concerns that we've had, when you look at the MTDP, we have 3% growth target. Somebody needs to be held accountable about that, to say, who are we going to ask after 2 years, how are we going to reach that amount? Now, you look at the budget, we look at 1.8% over the medium term. That's too low. Dangerous. You know, definitely we're already saying we're not going to reach these priorities before you even start the term. And that's that kind of investment I'm referring to. We have to be very bold and really ensure that targeted, productive investment in the economy. And I feel you're not going to be able to do that with only efficiency. You need to get more space for government revenue and a little of borrowing, of course, depending on it. But also the issue of borrowing is very interesting on the debt to GDP and the service costs as well. It grows regardlessly. Until we grow the economy, those will always grow in line with the way they are packed up. I mean, service costs will increase.
Maybe let's just put that in simple English for everyone, because I think you're making quite a significant statement here. If economic growth stays the same, then ultimately our debt to GDP ratio will continue to increase.
Debt service costs will continue to grow. Meaning that a bigger issue is to grow the economy. Because I mean, debt to GDP is a ratio, isn't it? Yeah. You know, so you need to expand the economic growth to get that ratio coming down. I mean, the issue of service costs, there's a lot of macroeconomic instruments plays into there. And I feel we haven't had that conversation in our society to say inflation, interest rates, some of those aspects plays a lot into I think Mr. Sajad did some sensitive analysis 2023 to show that actually, even if you don't do anything, your service costs will still increase by a certain level over the years. So hence I'm saying the key issue here for us is to get growth, get employment, and so on, which will really place quite well. Of course, I'm oversimplifying it largely because we're sitting here, but I think we need to go deeper into what that
100%.
means. Yeah.
But you're mentioning a very valid point here, because for any tax-paying citizen in South Africa, that becomes something that makes you uncomfortable in your seat and in your positioning, right? Understanding that the financial responsibility to our debt servicing costs continue to increase despite contributing to revenue. But Mr. Zibi,
can I offer a perspective here? Because, and I understand that the government is not like a company, but any company that doesn't periodically look at its structure and see whether it is optimal for what you are trying to do falls behind. It turns your objective into a pipe dream because the structure of the organization is facing this way, the goal is facing that way. And therefore you need to think about how you're going to swing this thing. One of the things I've been adamant about for a long time is that you don't actually need provinces. You don't actually, let me explain why. I know how provinces came about, by the way. In the negotiation, we've forgotten now. Some people in the room might remember. Do you remember that discussion about the Zulu state? Oh. About the Zulu state, that South Africa needs to be a federation. There were some homeland leaders who wanted to keep their homelands. You remember all of that stuff? Yes. Then we reached a compromise. And that compromise said, we are going to have provinces. And there were 9 provinces with weird names like PWV, one of them. You remember? It was PWV, Pretoria, Witwatersrand, and Vereeniging. And that secured the deal. And we ended up with the Ingonyama Trust and so on. We ended up with provinces. Gotcha. Provinces don't do much legislatively. They don't do much legislatively. They process national government policy into local government. Sometimes we've got the MEC for local government overseeing municipalities, but limited in how much they can intervene and so on. We've got 3 spheres of government, not 3 levels of government. If a minister or the president wants to intervene in a province, he has to invoke a section of the constitution which clearly defines what may be done and it limits it. So sometimes we sit here and we get frustrated that the change is not happening. There are legal impediments. But I want to make a very specific example here. And that one of the things that we are able to do in our gift is to reform the local government system. I come from a rural area. I must tell you, I love the people there. I love them, okay? But they also don't have, at a political level, the skills and the depth of knowledge to do what needs doing in that area. So the municipality receives money. You know already it's going to be spent badly. You know it. Because the officials can only do what council resolves. When you listen to the council conversation, you just know. You just know. So what I'm trying to say is we've got all of that's, again, and I'm quite able to speak about this at another time, so I don't waste your time. Political reforms are really critical to some of this problem. Otherwise, we keep throwing good money after bad. And we say there's an expenditure problem, there's this problem, etc., because we don't want to restructure how the government actually works so that it drives the outcomes that we're looking for.
Got you. Professor Havemann?
If I can just come in on an example. So, I mean, I think the debate is to what extent can we use expenditure to drive economic growth and investment to drive economic growth, which I think is a very important discussion to have. But just one example, which is that the Independent Power Producers Project has delivered 6 gigawatts or more of renewable energy onto the grid. The only thing the Treasury's had to do in the beginning was to provide a guarantee. It's a guarantee. There's no fiscal risk actually because of the structure of the guarantee. And those companies have borrowed the money themselves, they've invested the money themselves, and they've delivered electricity. So my personal view is I'm not sure that we need the government to do the borrowing and the investing. I think what we need to look at is models where we get that risk is shifted from the government into another. And I think the IPPs is a really good example.
Got you. And we're hoping that does translate into the railway space, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Let me add to Dr. Roy's point. But first, Gumani, your question has been answered in the sense that we actually agree there have been consolidation on public investment, not at total government spending.
So it's what we're spending on.
Yes.
So exactly. So essentially, to try and balance the books, government has been cutting fixed investment. It's politically less sensitive. It's not visible in your face. But today, I'm sure it's visible for people in Joburg when you drive. When you drive on roads, it's visible. You see water pipes that have burst. That's the fiscal consolidation that took place in the investment space. As far as Dr. Roy's point is concerned, I think that which the private sector can invest and make a profit at the same time delivering the service to citizens, the government must spend zero on it. That's as simple as that. If the private sector can provide buses to bus school kids or to bus people, and they can go and borrow money and buy buses, the government must spend zero.
But the private sector needs a conducive environment.
Exactly. So to his point, the legislative environment was changed in the electricity sector. The private sector invested 6 gigawatts of energy. Why can't that be the case? And the change in the legislation for energy was very quick. If eventually, even though it took a long time, we had a change from private sector being allowed to invest 1 megawatt to 10 to unlimited within a short space of time. Why can't that be the case with the rail sector?
Sounds like you're taking us back to political will, which was also brought up in terms of a key theme here. I am cognizant of the fact that we still want to respond to Sam's question, but of course I perhaps want us to get a quick overview of the many themes that I guess are the issues, right, that need to be typically contended with, not only in Parliament, by members of Cabinet, but also by us as key South African citizens. We're dealing with the budget where we know we are finding ourselves in trouble, where there's little fat to cut from, but there are avenues, but that in itself is held back by legislation, legislation which takes time. But at the same time, there's political will and alignment that perhaps is still lacking to ensure that that shift and change does take place. In terms of our economic progress, we do need to ensure that we keep investing for growth and are able to pull at those levers to ensure that we fast track and accelerate the necessary economic growth that we need. As a result, revenues won't be a problem. But of course, creating a conducive environment for private sector participants to come on board. There's a lot that we're contending with, and I guess for anyone who's sitting here in the room, we're probably feeling overwhelmed and uncertain. We heard feeling anxious earlier, and we often tend not to know what to do with much of this information. And I'd like to bring in some of the questions that have come through from the chat line, but also building up on Sam's question where he asked, where to now? As we've heard, we understand where we sit with the budget. There's a number of factors that are certainly at play, but where to now? What happens in the process? And as Honorable Zibi mentioned, we actually need people who are invested and participants in parliamentary proceedings. How do we as active South Africans actively participate here, Dr. Jantjies?
No, thanks, man. I think once the minister presents the budget tomorrow, the parliament process kick-starts from then. So there's sort of a clear process that outlines how that works. And the Minister of Finance present largely 4 instruments: your fiscal framework and revenue proposals, your division of revenue, your appropriations. So each and every one, it has its own timeline. So we start with fiscal framework and revenue proposals, which really an envelope of level of spending, level of revenue and debt that we want to have over the medium term. And that has to be first adopted, which means within 16 days, that has to be tabled in both houses. The report, as Honorable Zibi was saying earlier on, the finance committees will Tuesday entertain us and FFC, and Wednesday entertain the public participants. That's a very important part of it, because yesterday, what I said to your colleague yesterday, it's around that to say, what the opportunity for what has happened over the past 3 weeks or so is a more public awareness that actually the budget has not been done and dusted, as Honorable say. Public has a role to play.
How
public
do we do that as
in industry,
participants
sectors, everybody has a right. So from on Wednesday, you can submit your inputs. I mean, there's a timeline. Someone is saying timeline by when you should submit your fiscal framework-related input to say, we don't think VAT must be increased. We think this must be in place. You can do that as a citizen in South Africa. So what we've seen over time, we've seen that a lot of industries have been able to do that, particularly around fiscal framework related to VAT, related to tax, and so many other things. So there is opportunity where public can submit to Parliament. We want to have oral presentation.
Just for context and clarity, have we seen a heightened level of public participation in the past before? And I ask this because, as we now see, we are living in very different times, and there's a heightened level of interest from South Africans. Have we seen heightened participation in the past?
It has been increasing, particularly post-COVID-19, and how much we've seen virtual engagements, which now, there's a force to actually to get more public participation in the process. Okay. And I think when I criticize my colleagues in Parliament, is that look, we need to ensure that publics are aware of this space and they can come in, and Parliament is required by law, Constitution, to entertain those inputs. Before the report is tabled the following week, it should have taken into account our inputs to say, Dumisani says this, Gugu says this, and this is the way forward that we recommend. Even, in fiscal framework, likely if there are going to be any debate around taxes, that's when it's going to happen, because once you lock it, we can't change it later on to say, no, we don't VAT. We have to decide now whether we want VAT within the 16 days as a country. But obviously it gives Parliament space to amend as well, where they can say, okay, instead of VAT proposed by the Minister of Finance, we actually want no revenue, or we want this aspect. But they have to say, where does that money come from? And we will have to decide to determine that as a budget office, where would that, at least as an advice, what does that mean for the fiscal as a whole, and so on. Once the fiscal framework is adopted, the next stage, after 35 days from there, is the division of revenue, which talks to what you're saying, by different spheres, how much national gets, provinces gets, and already that has been locked in the fiscal framework, because that spend is locked in the fiscal framework. Once you've locked that out, whatever follows is just play within the envelope. You can't do anything outside the envelope.
And I'm assuming this is why we find some provinces perhaps being a little bit more vulnerable in terms of...
Yep.
the financial standing.
yes.
I'm thinking of KZN and the disasters and the additional allocation that was mentioned, but of course that might be needed in future even.
But
going
also that
forward.
also allows for public participation as well
Gotcha.
in the division of revenue. Provinces do come, everyone comes to say, no, we need more for this. But now, remember, now, like as I say, it's locked into that fiscal framework, 35 days, and that report has to be also be tabled, can be amended also, but within the envelope. Once it is done, after 4 months of start of financial year, as Honorable Zibi was saying, by June, appropriations bill come in. That's where the specific spending at the national level to say which department must get how much and so on. But that also, again, is within the envelope that has been adopted. So you can decide to take 20 rand from education to sports and so on, just within that context. Again, in that process, public is invited to participate in that process as well. And then within those stages, Parliament can amend the budget because of the law that allows that. I think I summarized it quite well.
Got you.
Yeah.
You have.
That was great.
It's quite a journey, and I
That's
think for
great.
many of us, quite insightful to understand what is still going to take place in the processes, but most importantly, understanding that we too can participate.
Yep.
I'm still keen to get a few questions, but there's one that I think is so critical that has come through from the LinkedIn Live that we're running, and I guess twofold, but I'm looking to merge it into one. Fully understanding that what the budget means and its impact on South Africans. And Dr. Havemann, perhaps this is where I can come to you, because when we look at your economic data and research, it's always a wonderful litmus test of our confidence, what we're seeing in terms of productivity, feedback on the budget. But we're sitting here as tax-paying citizens. You run formidable organizations. You are here because you want to leave here knowing what to do for your business, for yourself in terms of your personal dynamics, but most importantly, just having a clearer understanding of the South African environment, right? Or am I wrong? Okay,
You're right.
there we go. What do we do? How do we need to, number one, absorb the information from the budget? Number two, understand the processes that are coming on board, and perhaps also adding color and the detail to what Honorable Zibi has said. What does this mean for me, but also the environment within which we live now? Because that's what's going to shift the needle for us as South Africans.
I think you can think about it about what do I pay and what do I receive,
Some might say too much, too little.
and also what do I pay elsewhere, which Isaah is much better at. But what do I what do I pay is obviously the taxes that I pay, which is VAT. If that goes up, then you. And I think this is a very important point, which is that we always throw around the 7 million people are supporting.
Yes.
It's not true. Every single South African pays VAT.
taxed, yep.
In
Yeah.
actual fact, you probably pay VAT from roughly the time of conception on, because everything that your mother eats, you are essentially effectively. So every South African pays VAT, which is a good and bad thing, because it means everybody has a part of paying for running the country. So everybody pays taxes in some form. So obviously that increases, and so you have less money because you are paying more taxes. What do you receive? I mean, one of the good things, and I think Professor Jantjies highlighted, is that the budget does put down more money for education, which I think has been an issue in the past. There are questions about if we're trying to be too ambitious right now with education. For example, one of the things that was funded was grade R. Maybe we should be trying to fix the system before we start expanding the system, but that's a discussion I think we really just need to have.
Yep.
So what do you receive? So if you do use the public system, then you might be receiving a little bit more. A lot of people say they don't use the public system, so that's part of the problem. And then the third part is, as I will talk to this, is that the interest rate that you pay on your car loan or mortgage loan is linked to the government borrowing rate, and that fluctuates based on the fiscal stance. So if it's a bad budget, then overall interest rates across the economy rise. So I guess those are the three things to think about.
Maybe I
That
can
line,
add one more.
go
Okay,
ahead.
As an individual, if we just simplify it, what you owe those investors that borrow us money is now more. Per capita debt is going to be more, because we're going to go into the market, we borrow more money to finance all of this spending.
I'm looking at the audience because I'm trying to gauge your reactions, and all of us are just, yeah. Questions, feedback, responses before we do come to the panel for closing remarks, because there's a number of themes that we're certainly walking away with, but we do want to ensure that we leave here having just a better understanding of how to move forward, what to do, what to look out for, and questions to ask going forward. Ma'am, your hand was up. Please keep it up. It's just easier for my colleague to identify you, I assume. Perfect. Happy to take your hand too, sir. If there are other questions, please feel free to raise your hand up high. We'll be sure to get to them.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Olga Constantatos. I'm from Future Growth Asset Management. I've got a question really around, a lot of talk today has been around the political will that needs to be found, I guess, to make the decisions that we need, to get this economy going. And I guess I'm wondering, to me it feels like there's almost two hurdles now. There's political will, which has been absent, I think, for quite some time, and that was absent in a government that had a significant majority. Now we need political will and, I guess, alignment in terms of this, this GNU. And I guess my question maybe to the panel generally is, what needs to happen? What do you think needs to happen for the political will to be found? Because I guess the fear is maybe that we're just going to be seeing more of the same. So if one or all of the panelists could help me out with, what's it going to take to get the political will that we've talked about for a long time and that we need. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, ma'am. We'll take your question as well, sir, very briefly.
Hi, my name is Pumel Elo from Visio Fund Managers. So that covers my first question, because it was also around the whole political will, but maybe to extend to that, not just as what needs to happen, what is actually happening, because Mr. Zibi, you spoke there, and every time you spoke, you gave a very good diagnosis of what's really happening, and you really left me quite scared. I know you are not trying to scare me, but what is actually being done to ensure that, especially in cabinet, that in matters such as these, the politics or the parties don't really go and impugn their political views there, such that we are able to move forward and get consensus. But even more so to the public participation in the processes currently. Is there, well, let me ask it in two ways. Firstly, during those participations, how are the ultimate decisions arrived at? Do you take public views, and how is it used in the process to get to that ultimate decision or amendment that can be made? And secondly, I'm trying to get to a point where I understand whether it's redundant or not for public individuals to actually send forward their views where they're just going to be read, and ultimately the committee will be like, guys, we're trying to do this, we hear what's happening there, and we're going to move in this direction. So how does it become integrated, and is there any transparency to the public where we can get access or see or get a gauge as to what the views were there out there and how they were integrated in the whole decision-making process? Because you can get, let's say you get 10 or 20 or 30 people who do submit, and they're all against what has been put as a proposal in the budget. And ultimately what comes out is exactly what was put on the budget. Sure. And we have no way of knowing, what were the views out there. So I think those are just the two questions I have.
Got you. Thank you so much. What is happening? What is likely going to happen next? And of course, an understanding of the procedure. Perhaps let's get your question too, ma'am. Then we'll incorporate it into the closing remarks of the panelists as they give us their feedback.
Thank you so much. It was really a related question on the political side. It's a bit of a tough question to ask, but when we're still finding our way in terms of GNU as investors. When the GNU was initially formed, we could understand the rationale really along the lines of electing a president, making sure there's no motion of no confidence in the government, and then passing a budget, were our original expectations as the output of the process. Now, with the ANC really acting in this particular instance like a minority government and not within a GNU per se, does that change the rules of the game in terms of how we should think about is the GNU fit for purpose for our current political climate? Thank you.
Great question. Fantastic. Happy to get your responses to these questions as we make our way down the panel, just to incorporate them into key remarks that we need to be mindful of.
No, thanks very much. I think look, there are some really good things, by the way, going on. So I speak to a lot of ministers from all the parties. I must tell you, I haven't met a single minister from the DA or the ANC who is not determined to make the GNU work. They truly are committed
So we don't
to
have
their
a
portfolio.
French problem,
They truly
German
are
problem.
committed to the portfolios they've been given. I've spoken to Sfue Kwagube from the DA. I speak to ministers from other portfolio committees. You've seen the work that Leon Schreiber is doing at Home Affairs, etc., etc. It's not just the DA, it's all the political parties. People understand that the risks of a collapse in the GNU are too great for the country to let it happen. I think what we need to accept is that within that commitment, there are going to be there really are going to be tensions, and we must not expect them. We will deceive ourselves. We will deceive ourselves. This is a new environment for everybody. Nobody has had to do this at a national level before. And I really beg of people to understand that you're dealing with humans here, with political dynamics within their portfolios. But I must tell you, John Steenhuisen speaks about his portfolio most of the time, rather than the politics. He really, really does. So that's an important thing to take away. And what I was saying earlier on is that it is the job of the president and the various political leaders therein to make sure that that commitment is what binds cabinet together as a body. And that united front is important. I don't want to betray confidences here. But what I said earlier about actors outside cabinet, but within the political parties, are creating some of the problems in the GNU. They really are. There are people who are upset because they missed out on cabinet positions. And so they spend from all the parties, by the way, from all the parties, there are those significant problems. And so whether it is the president or John, they're managing these complexities within their political parties and so on. Otherwise, if you don't keep your political coalition together, you have no legitimacy and support in government.
Ignore the noise.
Right, so you can only ignore the noise so much before it becomes a problem for you politically, with the people who showed their hands and said, we want you as leader. So you always need to keep them with you, and you need to give them a bone and show that you're fighting. So I think that's really important. The second and last thing that I want to say, the thought that I want to leave all of us with here, is that there is nothing better than a crisis for focusing minds, right? I actually have been dying for Parliament to have to deal with this problem so that people don't sleepwalk through the budgeting process. I must tell you, every political party now is digging deep into this document. They really are, which many of them just, haven't done with that level of seriousness before. They're having to do it now. And people like Dr. Jantjies and Treasury are going to tell them, fine, we can borrow more, but this number, 442 billion, that we're going to pay on debt service costs is going to become 500 billion. Are you happy with that?
Yeah.
Then people start scratching their heads. It's an important teaching moment. It's scary, it's anxiety-inducing, but for the first time, you might actually see some seriousness around budgeting issues, which has been missing before. People stand up, make statements, sit down, they don't care what happens after.
And I think what you're highlighting is also a greater appreciation now that will probably be created in terms of having the role of being a member of Parliament and sitting in cabinet and taking these key decisions, that it really is a responsibility that needs to be carried with the highest level of aptitude. Dr. Jantjies, if we can get your response to the concerns that have been raised, but also just an understanding on the inclusion of public opinions.
Yes, I think it builds well with what Honorable Zibi is saying. I'll just focus on the public participation. It's a very important part of it. What has happened over the years, we have seen a lot of public participation, people submitting the inputs into the processes. But what has been lacking, it's a follow-through. Most of the time, you find that people submit the inputs, but there has to be recognition that actually Minister of Finance has to respond to those inputs. And he does respond to, in the budget document, a lot of times, particularly in the years that starts there. So as citizens, as South Africans, as investors, as different stakeholders, our inputs have to be taken into account in law. But the follow-through is a bigger issue. But even in Parliament itself, what has been the criticisms internally, in my view, also has been that at times when public submissions are made, a report is presented which summarizes those key inputs. These are the issues that have been raised, and it gets tabled in the houses. And at times there's a recommendations. Next year, the same issues get raised, but we don't ever go back to say what was the conclusion. And that's a bigger part of it. It is a transparent process. You can see that report. It's public to see these are the issues that were raised. And even the engagement, it's open, Honorable Zibi, it's open to public, so it's not secretive. The interesting part for me, Gugu, for this time around is the awareness that's been there around the public participation, public awareness of what's been happening, but there seemed to be expectation for more inputs will come from the public. More inputs will come from the public. The question is to say what you're saying, how is Parliament going to deal with the contestations? Because clearly there's going to be contestations. And to agree or to have a report, there must be some alignment in the report. So it's really interesting because it's going to be for the first time where we see lack of majority in the committee itself where there are a lot of contestations. So it'd be interesting to answer your point to say maybe there will be some dissent voice, which we've had in any case, even during majority. You'd had parties who would say, we're not going to support the report, but because they don't have majority, it went through anyway. Gotcha. But now the bigger issue, which I would encourage the investors, everybody here, is to follow through to see what happens subsequent to that, because if there's an amendment, it has to come through that process, no any other process.
Got you.
Yep.
100%.
Thanks. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Havemann, your closing remarks and I guess thoughts and perspective and questions that have come through largely focused on perhaps maybe not on so much political will, but of course, maybe if you could go back to National Treasury, what would you do differently?
No, I think I'm kind of quite proud of the Treasury. In some ways, I'm not a huge, I think that they tried their best, and I think that goes to my point, which is that we have these incredible institutions, and we've done this before. I mean, I was looking up at the timeline for getting the previous VAT increase through, which finally got through Parliament in January of the following financial year, of the following calendar year. So they just made the deadline for the financial year. This budget that was tabled last year only got passed also in January this year, I think finally went through. The institutions are all there and they're all set up and they actually have been quite good at doing this all the years. People have just not really been paying attention. And they've been not paying attention because actually what they say doesn't matter. So they've kind of not been participating. But now it does actually matter. You've got a parliamentary budget office. You've got a Finance and Fiscal Commission, which is there to advise on the division of revenue. You've got a Treasury, which does the initial proposals and processes all the things. And you've got a Parliament, you've got standing committees and everything. So the machinery is all there. And in a way, the machinery is almost built for the GNU, because now, hopefully the GNU, and it does sound like the GNU is going to do it, is going to take the machinery and use it to deliver a better budget.
100%, got you. Azad, there's a lot that we certainly have absorbed today, but I guess that the feedback has been very clear from yourself and your colleagues, and of course ongoing conversations that will have to take place. But your closing remarks, and I guess even addressing some of the concerns that have been brought to the fore regarding what happens next, GNU, how do we continue to take our decisions going forward on the back of these themes that have been raised?
I think I echo the comments from colleagues on the panel. The postponement of this budget in February, I actually think it's a positive thing. Yes, there was a lot of uncertainty, but it brought to light the actual process that takes place when a budget is tabled, that many didn't actually follow and understand. The second point would be a 2 percentage point increase in VAT that was initially proposed. I think also it brings society to actually debate the priorities and how we fund those priorities. Yes, we ended up with a 1 percentage point increase over 2 years. It's costly at a personal level. It's costly for businesses because they have to adjust their technology in order to make sure that VAT is collected for SARS. But at the end of the day, it brings us to an understanding that spending, no matter how noble it is, it has to be funded from somewhere. And we must contend with how do we fund that spending. But overall, I'm glad and happy and commend National Treasury for painting a clear picture to political players in terms of the overall fiscal framework, to say we have promised investors this is how much we're going to borrow in October last year. We are sticking with that path. We are committing to a debt level that is sustainable, that the country can carry, given the levels of economic growth in the country. We will make the adjustments on both the revenue and the spending as necessary, but we are sticking with a consolidation path that ensures that the debt servicing costs do not skyrocket and bring us to a fiscal crisis. So we have to commend National Treasury there. But overall, what we see in the budget are the priorities, options, and choices of elected political leaders. That's how we should view it.
100%. Long learning curve that we certainly on here, ladies and gentlemen. Lots of conversations that will continue to take place, and of course, themes that will come up that will impact our businesses and of course us as individuals differently. If this has taught us anything in today's conversation, is not to be anxious. Is perhaps not to be scared, not to be frustrated. Maybe it's okay to feel those emotions, but fundamentally know that this has actually elevated the level of awareness and understanding that we need to have of our budgeting process and just how these critical decisions have been made. Perhaps it's not so much a money problem, but where the money is going and where the money is coming from, as has been highlighted by our panelists here this morning. So I hope that this at least leaves you a lot more encouraged to understand that the knowledge and the information and the processes are set out. The individuals who are trying to drive change within different spheres of society are certainly there, and it takes us as well as proactive participants in South Africa's economy to ensure that we do provide the shift and the changes that we need to see within the environment. So on that note, please, ladies and gentlemen, give my counterparts and panelists a round of applause as they stand up and make their way off of stage. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Our panelists will be making, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Roy. Much appreciated. Thanks, Isaah. Well, our panelists will be making their way down the stage, but of course, just before we do wrap up the program, it is also pertinent that we help you understand how you can continue your journey with RMB as a key partner. This is nice when everyone gets along. Can't they do this in Parliament? Right? That's what we need more of, essentially. Seeking alignment, despite the fact that we might have different outputs and different views on certain factors and themes. But as mentioned, this camaraderie and partnership is something that is extended to you by the team at RMB, and of course, key partners who have you here, and through your journey together with them as key clients and stakeholders will continue to journey with you in helping you understand the options, the dynamics, and most importantly, the commitment that they make to you as an institution. But to give us our closing remarks before we make our way out and continue to conquer the economy, please warmly welcome to the front of the stage the Head of Corporate Client Group in RMB Global Markets, Thobeka Thubela. A warm welcome to her, please.
On behalf of RMB and Global Markets, I just want to say thank you so much to our esteemed speakers, and most importantly to our client. We always aim to assist you in terms of how you actually progress and make decisions, and in that process we'll continue to become your partners. So I thought maybe just in closing to say that there's always a silver lining at the end of every dark cloud. I came across this quote from the AI in the world of technology. These days anything comes quite quick. To talk us about the importance of strong leadership and accountability, that it fosters trust, improve engagement, boosts productivity, enhances decision making, promote innovation, create positive culture by ensuring that everyone contributes towards achieving shared goals. I feel like at the point of our democracy, that is what is currently happening. It's a process we're had. It's difficult to turn the wheels of change within government. However, with you as investors, with you as corporate players that are key to the economy in partnership and assisting the board members of South Africa, not only the ministers, we can actually collectively contribute towards a positive essay that we want to be part of. So with that, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you so much, Tobeka. Really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy refreshments that are available outside. Of course, there will be ongoing feedback and interaction with you from the RMB Global Markets team. So please do engage, ask questions, share feedback. To those of you who have joined us online, we appreciate your participation. And we look forward to discussing this and more outcomes again with you soon. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day further.